The ToyBox Killer, a tale of terror and survival. There are dark corners of human nature we all wish didn't exist. Some stories stay with us long after we hear them, gnawing at our sense of safety and decency. The story of the ToyBox Killer, whose real name was Daniel Pierce, is one of those cases. It's a tale of horror, but also of resilience, because if one woman hadn't escaped, who knows how many more lives would have been lost. A broken childhood, a twisted mind, every villain has an origin story, and while it never excuses their actions, it often offers a chilling insight into their evolution. Daniel Pierce was born in 1939 in a small town in New Mexico. His father was a violent alcoholic who beat him and his sister relentlessly. But the abuse didn't stop at home. Daniel was also bullied at school, humiliated, and ostracized. The cruelty he endured seemed to shape him, warping his mind in ways that would later surface in terrifying ways. Imagine being a child, confused and scared, and being presented with images of suffering and control as if they were normal. That exposure is a seed, and over time, it grows into something monstrous. By the time he reached adulthood, Daniel had learned to hide in plain sight. To his coworkers, he was a friendly mechanic, a skilled craftsman who could fix anything. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet guy living in a small desert town. No one suspected that behind the doors of his trailer lay a torture chamber he called the Toy Box. A nightmare in the desert. Daniel and his girlfriend, Christine Hall, spent years carefully crafting their house of horrors. They invested over $100,000 into an empty trailer, soundproofing it, and filling it with the most horrific devices imaginable: whips, chains, electrocution tools, surgical instruments, and homemade contraptions designed to inflict maximum pain. He didn't just want to torture, he wanted to control. Christine wasn't just a bystander, she was an active participant. She helped him lure women, usually drifters or sex workers, knowing that society would care little if they disappeared. And disappear they did. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is that Daniel recorded himself speaking to his victims before their torture began. He played a pre-recorded message where he methodically explained what would happen to them. It wasn't just sadism, it was psychological warfare. The one who got away on March 22nd, 1999, Daniel made a fatal mistake. He underestimated his victim. Samantha Vega, a woman he had abducted under the guise of being a police officer, was not going to die in that trailer. For 3 days, she was tortured and drugged, but she never gave up hope. Then an opportunity presented itself. Christine, who had been assigned to watch her, had left the keys too close to the bed. With all her strength, Samantha lunged for them, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the bonds. Christine heard the noise and rushed in, attacking Samantha with a lamp. But Samantha fought back. In a desperate move, she picked up a chisel and threw it at Christine. She ran barefoot, wearing only a dog collar, screaming for help. Cars passed her, people ignored her, but she kept running. Finally, someone opened the door. That moment changed everything, uncovering the horrors. The police, at first skeptical because Samantha was a sex worker, soon realized she was telling the truth. When they searched Daniel's property, what they found was beyond their worst nightmares: evidence of dozens of victims, a chilling tally of assaults, and most disturbingly, videos and photographs of unknown women in agony. The FBI got involved, and through a small tattoo, they found another survivor, Laura Mitchell, who had no memory of her captivity. It was only when she saw herself in the recovered footage that the memories came rushing back. Justice served, but not enough. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Daniel claimed he had done nothing wrong. He insisted that every woman had consented, despite the chains, the drugs, and the torture devices. His lack of remorse was staggering. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but karma had its own plans. Before he could serve a single year, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. Some might call it justice. Others might say it was too easy of an end for a man who inflicted so much pain. Unanswered questions. To this day, no bodies have been found. Authorities suspect he murdered 40 to 60 women, but without physical evidence, we may never know. The desert is vast. The lake near his home, a suspected dumping ground, was never properly searched. But perhaps the most terrifying thought is this: how many more people like him are out there? What do you think? Should the authorities have done more to search for his victims? How do we stop people like this before they become monsters? What would you have done in Samantha's position? Evil exists, but so does courage, and sometimes one woman's escape is enough to bring down a monster. The lingering shadows of evil. Evil like Daniel Pierce's doesn't just disappear with his death. It lingers like a stain on the places he haunted and the lives he destroyed. Though he was gone, the questions he left behind remained unanswered. How many victims were there, truly? How deep did his network run? And the most disturbing thought, was he truly the only one? For every serial predator caught, how many remain unseen, blending into society, hiding behind the masks of normalcy? How many more toy boxes exist, locked away in garages, basements, or secluded trailers in forgotten corners of the world? The Survivors, a lifetime of healing for Samantha Vega and Laura Mitchell, and for the other women who never came forward. The scars of what happened in that desert weren't just physical, they were psychological. Trauma like that doesn't simply vanish with time. It seeps into the bones, into the subconscious, into the way they live every single day. Imagine waking up every night, reliving the terror. Imagine not knowing how much of your memory is real and how much has been lost to the drugs he forced into your system. Imagine trying to rebuild your life, knowing that most people will never truly understand what you went through. Society often expects survivors to just move on. But how do you move on from something so unspeakable? How do you trust again? How do you walk down a street at night without feeling the phantom weight of a chain around your neck? Would you ever feel safe again? The role of law enforcement, missed opportunities. One of the most infuriating aspects of this case is how many times it could have been stopped. Long before Samantha's escape, someone had already warned the FBI, Daniel's own daughter, Jessica Pierce. She had called in an anonymous tip years before his arrest, stating that he was kidnapping women and selling them into human trafficking. The FBI questioned him but never pursued it further. Had they taken that tip seriously, how many lives could have been saved? Then there was Laura's case. She had been kidnapped in 1996, drugged and tortured for days, then dumped on the side of a road. When she was found and taken home, her husband didn't believe her story. He assumed she had been on a drug binge or had been unfaithful. Instead of supporting her, he filed for divorce. How many other women went through the same thing? How many victims tried to report what had happened to them, only to be dismissed, ignored, or even blamed? The unsearched lake, a cemetery in the water. And then there's the lake. Authorities believe Daniel may have dumped multiple bodies into Elephant Butte Lake, a vast man-made reservoir near his home. His accomplice, Christine Hall, even admitted that she had helped dispose of bodies there. So why didn't they search it? The official reason? Too deep, too murky, too expensive. Think about that. How much is closure worth? How much is justice worth? How many families still wonder to this day if their missing loved one is lying at the bottom of that lake, lost to time? Would it have been expensive? Sure. But wasn't it worth it? Or did they just not care enough? Monsters Among Us, the fans of a serial killer. Perhaps one of the most disturbing revelations of this case didn't come from Daniel Pierce himself, but from his admirers. When news of the case broke, some people weren't horrified. They were fascinated. They flooded forums and comment sections, calling him a genius, a mastermind, even a hero. Yes, a hero. Let that sink in. What does it say about our world that there are people right now who idolize men like him? What does it say about the dark corners of the internet, where predators lurk and find camaraderie instead of condemnation? If there are people who admire what he did, how many of them are planning to follow in his footsteps? How do we stop the next Daniel Pierce before he builds his own toy box? Final thoughts: the unfinished story. The toy box killer is dead, but the story isn't over. His crimes may be solved on paper, but justice feels incomplete. The lake remains unsearched. The full number of victims remains unknown. His daughter, Jessica Pierce, walked away after serving only 2.5 years. Her involvement in his crimes still a mystery. And worst of all, we don't know how many more like him exist today. So I'll leave you with these questions. Do you think law enforcement failed these victims? Should the lake have been searched, no matter the cost? Why do you think some people idolize killers like Daniel Pierce? How do we stop predators like him before they strike? Because if this case teaches us anything, it's that monsters aren't always hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're right next door. The bigger picture: how society creates monsters. Evil isn't born, it's made. Yes, there are people with deep-seated psychological disorders, but most serial offenders aren't just created in a vacuum. They are shaped by their environment, their upbringing, their influences. And the story of Daniel Pierce forces us to ask, how many other monsters are we unknowingly raising? Daniel grew up in abuse, neglect, and violence. His father was an alcoholic who normalized cruelty, misogyny, and control. His exposure to violent pornography at an early age warped his perception of sex and power. His bullying at school reinforced his hatred toward others. Does that excuse what he became? No. But does it explain it? Absolutely. How many young boys today are growing up in similar circumstances? How many are being exposed to violent, degrading images of women before they even understand what a healthy relationship looks like? How many are learning that control and violence are power? If we want to stop the next Daniel Pierce, we have to start before the toy box gets built. We have to teach young boys that violence is not strength. We have to educate people about the warning signs of future predators. We have to stop ignoring the early red flags, because monsters don't just appear overnight. The failures of the justice system. It's frustrating, infuriating, even, how often serial predators slip through the cracks. But when we begin to glorify the killers, to romanticize their actions, it becomes dangerous. It shifts from understanding the horror to celebrating it. These are not characters from a crime drama. They are real people whose lives were shattered by unspeakable evil. The moment we start talking about serial killers like Daniel Pierce as if they're some kind of twisted celebrities, we normalize the horror. The idea of true crime as entertainment becomes dangerous, especially when we forget the victims, their names, their faces, their stories. It's a slippery slope, and we need to be careful about how we engage with these stories. Because when we talk about killers like Daniel Pierce, it's not just about the crime, it's about the people whose lives he destroyed. Every episode of a podcast, every video posted, should serve to remind us that these victims were real, and their pain was real. When does curiosity cross the line into exploitation? And how do we make sure we're never more fascinated by the killer than the lives he ruined? And let's think about those who are vulnerable, those who are marginalized, who are too often overlooked or ignored. The women Daniel Pierce preyed on were largely invisible to society, and it wasn't just because they were women. It was because they were often sex workers, drifters, and people on the fringe. We need to change that narrative. We need to remember that every victim's story matters, and we need to ask ourselves, how many more people are out there who need us to listen? How do we shift the focus from killers to victims? And how do we create a world where fewer people are ignored, dismissed, or silenced before it's too late? But these were real people, real victims. They aren't just names in a documentary. They had lives, families, dreams. Despite decades of crimes, dozens of victims, and mountains of disturbing evidence, the courts could only charge him with 3 cases. 3. That number alone tells you everything you need to know about how broken our system really is. The 3 cases that made it to court. Think about how monstrous this man was. Investigators found a torture chamber filled with equipment designed to cause unimaginable pain. A diary listing dozens of victims, their abductions, and the horrors inflicted on them. Videotapes of women being tortured and abused, some of whom were never identified. And yet, only 3 cases could be brought to trial. Samantha Vega, the woman who fought for her life, stabbed his girlfriend with an ice pick, and escaped in broad daylight. Laura Mitchell, the woman who didn't even know she was a victim until she saw herself on the FBI's footage. Angelica Vega, the woman who had already reported her abuse years earlier, was ignored. Each of these women was brave beyond words. They stepped forward, faced their monster, and told the world what he had done to them. But what about the others? What about the women in the photographs, the ones in the videos, the ones whose names were never written down? What about the ones who didn't escape? The trial that should have been unnecessary. Let's be honest. This trial should have never happened. He should have been stopped decades ago. He should have been investigated when his daughter reported him. He should have been caught when Laura first tried to tell her story. Instead, he was allowed to keep going for years, for decades. And when he finally did get caught, the courts still couldn't deliver full justice. Investigators believed he killed 40 to 60 women, but they had no bodies, so they had no way to prove it. They had journals, recordings, and photographs, but no human remains, no burial sites, no hard proof of murder. Why? Because this man was meticulous. He knew how the system worked. He knew that without a body, murder is hard to prove. And he knew that if he got rid of the evidence properly, he could keep getting away with it. The joke of a sentence. Did he really pay for his crimes? In the end, Daniel Pierce received a 224-year prison sentence, and yet he never served a single year. Why? Because 2 years later, he had a heart attack and died. That's it. No suffering, no real consequences, just a quick death, far easier than what he put his victims through. And what's worse, his daughter, his accomplice, barely faced any punishment. The daughter who walked free. Jessica Pierce was deeply involved in her father's crimes. She lured women to their deaths. She drugged them. She stood by and let the torture happen. And yet she served only 2.5 years in prison. Let that sink in. 2.5 years. For helping her father kidnap, drug, and torture multiple women. A woman in America can get more prison time for stealing food than Jessica got for helping her father commit some of the most horrific crimes in history. How does that make sense? How is that justice? What message does that send to future criminals? If all you have to do is serve a couple of years and walk free, what's stopping the next Jessica Pierce from doing it again? The victims who never got justice. The biggest tragedy of this case isn't that Daniel Pierce died too soon. It's that so many of his victims never got justice. The women who were tortured, raped, and possibly murdered, their families never got closure. Their bodies were never found. Their stories were never told. Because no one searched for them. No one drained the lake where Christine Hall said the bodies were dumped. No one dug deep enough into his property. No one followed up on the anonymous tips that came years before his arrest. They were just forgotten. And if justice means anything, it should mean that no victim is ever forgotten. A system built to fail. If this case tells us anything, it's that the justice system is not built for victims. It's built for convenience. It's easier to ignore sex workers, drug addicts, and missing women than to investigate their disappearances. It's built for saving money. Searching that lake was too expensive, so instead the victims were left at the bottom, erased from history. It's built for protecting itself. The police ignored the warning signs because admitting they failed means admitting responsibility. And while the system protects itself, monsters like Daniel Pierce keep hunting. How many more are out there? How many serial predators are right now, at this very moment, living their lives, hurting people, knowing that the system won't stop them until it's too late? Um, how many missing women will never be found because no one cares enough to look for them? Justice never came, so what now? Justice in this case was never fully served, so the responsibility falls on us. We have to remember the victims, every single one of them, the ones who survived and the ones who never made it out. We have to demand better. We have to hold law enforcement accountable for ignoring red flags and dismissing missing persons cases. We have to pay attention. Predators don't work in isolation. There are warning signs, but only if we choose to see them. Because if we forget this case, if we let this be just another true crime story we listen to and move on from, then it's only a matter of time before another predator builds another toy box. And next time, we might not be lucky enough to stop them. What do you think? Do you believe Jessica Pierce should have served a longer sentence? Should law enforcement have done more to find his victims? Why do you think society ignores certain victims while searching desperately for others? If Cynthia hadn't escaped, how much longer do you think he would have kept going?